One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. And can I remind you that Scéalta is a joint production of Fáilte Féile to Here and Féile and Phobail. My guest this evening is Daniel Holder. He is the Deputy Director of a human rights organisation based in Belfast. The organisation is the Committee on the Administration of Justice. Daniel, welcome to Scéalta.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I know that the CAJ has been quite active in many issues, but it's always been active a wee bit below the scenes. So maybe if we begin by just explaining to us what the function and the role of it is.
Yeah, I suppose sometimes it is good to do stuff behind the scenes. We don't do everything for PR. But we're a human rights NGO. There are human rights NGOs around the planet working in all sorts of situations and circumstances. We were born in the era of conflict. We were born in 1981. We've been around for a long time now. There's sort of various stages of CAJ's existence. I suppose at the beginning, it was much more about trying to stop human rights violations happening as they were happening, getting people to document what had happened. So with the hope that someday there would be some way of having it dealt with. With a sort of second phase of existence, which was really trying to mainstream things within the peace settlement, trying to make sure that human rights was at the core of the peace settlement and there was a solid basis for going forward. And then ever since, I suppose we've been pretty heavily focused on trying to get most of what were the rights-based provisions within the peace settlement actually implemented, and dealing with the abject frustration that many people across the community will have faced of agreements being reached and then being reneged upon by key actors, most notably the British government that was responsible for most of the implementation. Our work, although we've done a lot of stuff on legacy, police reform and things like that, we do fit the full gambit of human rights though. Because if you think of what fueled conflict here, well, I mean, there were numerous things, but all of the socioeconomic things, the inequality, the poverty, housing being an obvious example, which remains an issue today, and at times it almost remains a taboo issue. You're still not really supposed to talk about. You're meant to talk in general terms about how terrible it is housing is segregated, but not talk about the causes of that, or why, or even to dip into housing inequality. So I suppose the role of CAJ is we're totally independent. We've never taken a penny of public money, which I think really helps in maintaining independence. It does mean you have to battle for other sources of funding, of course, but that's the story of the whole third sector. But it does mean we can get to places that a lot of other organisations within that sector can't get to. You can say things you're not supposed to say, and you can engage. You can raise issues that others would feel vulnerable raising. And I think that's the strength of the organisation.
Strangely, you saying that, because like yourself, I go to meetings and conferences certainly on a weekly basis, but you're always there.
Yeah.
You're always represented there. If it's not you, it's someone else from your office.
And there's only 7 of us.
And there's only 7 of us, and these are everywhere. But one of the things, and part of the purpose of the Scéalta programme, but one of the things that I hear regularly is after you speak, and you make a point of speaking, and you make a point of challenging or giving advice, and that's to be commended, and that's the reason you go to conferences. But one of the things I always hear is someone saying, who is that? Is he a solicitor? Who is he? Who is that fella? And part of it is because you don't have the traditional Belfast accent, although you've been in Belfast for a long, long time. So can I ask you, what was the journey into the human rights field, and then how did you end up in Belfast? So clearly you have spent part of your life, or some of your life, in England. So tell me a wee bit about that.
Spent my childhood in England. I've not spent any part of my adult life there, and it does seem like a long time ago, but I did spend my childhood there, and I suppose it's been a long journey, and like a lot of people, it's kind of just happened rather than it being by some sort of grand plan. I was born in rural County Durham, in a wee mining village, which was where I'd have been during the sort of latter half of the 1970s as a small child. It would have been obviously a mining village then. It isn't now, and hasn't been for for a long time. I have to say, I mean, we moved to the city, or the outskirts of the city in Newcastle upon Tyne in the sort of early 80s. My dad was a community worker working within the mining communities, and then within the city later. My mother's a social worker, retired now. My dad died when I was about 15, so after a sort of long illness, so that sort of dominated my childhood as well. But I was introduced to activism and social causes at that early age. I think the miners' strike would have been a big thing. Now I was only 10 now.
Yeah.
but still, I remember that. I remember being on demonstrations. Same with the anti-nuclear stuff that was pretty big at that time, and it was the whole Thatcher time. It was a time of, great upheaval, obviously here but there as well.
Daniel, that journey from teenager in a mining village in England to that whole human rights world that you're currently involved in. I know your father was ill when you were very young, from I think you were about 10 or 12 or 15 when your father began to be seriously ill. Your mother, had your mother a big influence on your life?
I'm sure she did. It's not something I've ever thought about, and probably should when you get to a stage of life, reflect on that. But yeah, she's still going strong, and I'm sure she did. She was had a social conscience in the same way my dad did. So yeah, I'm sure she did in those years.
Was it a radical household?
It wasn't that radical, and I mean, it was. I suppose the time was taken up by living with the reality of illness, but it was radical enough, I would say. Yeah.
Your university life was in Belfast, was it Queens?
That's right, it was Queens, yeah.
How do you tell this mother who's in a very quiet and genteel part of England, I'm going into Belfast, and it's a bit like saying I'm going to Beirut?
Well, first of all, I'd dispute that Newcastle upon Tyne was a quiet and genteel part of England. But no, I'd put down Scottish, and I'd put down universities and Queens, and
what
it was Queens
this?
ultimately. This would have been 93, I think. 93 it would have been. I did some of my university time at Queens, some in the University of Havana and Santa Clara, which was another experience. But yeah, this would have been 1993. What I ended up studying was sociology and Spanish.
And you got a degree in sociology?
Yep, a degree in sociology and Spanish, both of them.
Can I ask you, as a young man coming to Belfast, and you're right about Newcastle, you're absolutely right about it, it isn't that genteel, and I've been there a number of occasions, but was the Belfast that you came to, was it what you expected? Was it frightening? Was it a good experience?
It was a good experience. Obviously, like many people growing up over the water that wouldn't have had much of a connection to here, I'd had the sort of two tribes propaganda narrative drummed into my head from birth, and there would have been a very significant amount of demonisation, including demonisation of the community here in the West. So I'd have had that drummed into me. I did become not that active, but active enough within the sort of students' union, and picked up some of the politics in there. It's interesting. You sort of that pact the DUP had with Theresa May's government was the first time a lot of English people in the English left had sort of heard of the DUP and were quite horrified. I had that experience a lot earlier in the students' union, with hitting some of the themes. Interestingly, some of the themes that were most vociferously disputed at that time were precisely gay rights in the Irish language, which are issues we're still battling with, and almost a sort of hegemony of trying to normalise what the status quo was, that somehow the idea that an English only environment was somehow the norm, and it was okay to focus on a tiny bit of the politics around the Irish language and not the sort of centuries of legislative and other forms of intervention to suppress and minoritise it. But yeah, some of those discussions, the attempts to block any measure of progress on the Irish language and gay rights were very live issues in those times, which was 25 years ago now.
It seems like only 30 years ago, funny enough. So it seems a long time ago.
It might be, yeah, it almost is 30 years ago, that's right.
And then from Queens to the Havana.
Yep.
And what a journey, you know. How did you find Cuba?
Well, the first time I was there, I spent a year there, first of all, actually a year before I ended up in Queens, and that was in Santa Clara, which is a city in the middle of the country. It's I suppose it's well known for being the city that Che Guevara took, and that was the end of the Batista dictatorship in 1959. So that was a much more sort of rural setting, maybe a city about the size of Derry, with a university outside of it. And then after that, I spent a number of years in Havana, one at the University of Havana, others working in linguistics, and huge experience as a young person to do that, and it kind of changed your outlook on everything. And it was at a very heightened moment of which there've been many of Cuban history as well. This was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is one of the things they wanted was young people who were willing to go and teach English, reorientate a lot of the language, speaking not away from Russian, that was still taught, but towards a much broader range of languages as the global reality sort of changed. And it was a time of sort of great economic, a special period in peacetime as it was called, upheaval. But I suppose I then ended up meeting a lot of people. I ended up learning a language incredibly quickly. I mean, talk about language immersion, but being dropped into a situation where you have to learn a language that you know only a few words of to fluency within about 6 months or a year, which I managed to do.
Very good.
And I'm still which is less good. I'm still a failed Irish speaker in the sense I've tried numerous times to get beyond a level of basic knowledge, and I haven't managed it yet. Lifetime project I will do, but in terms of that immersion thing, I've just been thrown into an environment where you have to speak a language every day, learn it, or you'd really sink, not swim, and get very bored. And it opens up a whole different world to you.
I was going to ask you that. Do you adapt well? You know, in Belfast, okay, you know, you're not a million miles away from England. There's a common language at least. Cuba's a different kettle of fish. You must have been quite young when you went to Cuba.
I was only sort of 18 the first time I went. And
were you homesick? Did you adapt well?
I wasn't homesick. No, I did adapt. There was just so much happening. It was like sort of running a race, that you had to, and particularly that thing of learning the language, and also you got a different perspective on the world, not just from the sort of fairly unique circumstance Cuba was in and from Cubans there, but also from, like, I met people from all over the planet who were in that, international students in that university, mostly from Africa or the rest of Latin America, and it gave you a totally different perspective on how the great powers of the world, as they like to call themselves, the US, Britain and various other powers, had what their real role in the world was and how much damage they'd done over the course of history, and how that was still shaping the present, was still shaping the ethnic and political divisions around the planet, and still does, and how a lot of the official truths that are propagated are really sort of huge false narratives that need unpicking at every sort of stage. I
was going to ask you that, and I've spoken to other people who had a similar experience, not exactly the same, but the kind of we talk about when they came into contact with people who are from another environment, perhaps a colonial situation, that they begin to realise what we have been taught in school, what I have learned, what I read, what I hear in the news, ain't the story. Did you have that kind of
I did have that experience. I can remember having long conversations with students, who were medical students from Belize, or British Honduras, as it was officially known at one point, at least to those who colonised it, not to perhaps the people who lived there, and also people from other parts of the Caribbean. But certainly the discussions with some of the Belizean students, I do have fairly, and this would have been in the early time when I still couldn't sustain a proper discussion in Spanish. So speaking to other
there.
English
You got
kids,
there.
oh, I did get there, and that opens up as all sort of bilingual people will know, whether it's Irish, whether it's another language, it opens up a whole new world. In some senses, and that's the work I ended up doing when I was there, doing translation, and working in a press agency doing translation. But yeah, it does open up a whole new world. But yes, the whole thing of realizing the impact of colonial history in a way that I've been taught, although I was always taught to question, which we dipped into earlier on.
Yeah.
But yes, to get a perspective of that magnitude, and to really realize that the world was viewed differently by the overwhelming majority of its population that live in the majority world, as it could be called.
Was it a hard decision to leave Cuba to come back? Did you come back right to Ireland, or did you go back?
I went there and back a few times. And it wasn't. There was things I think I liked living in an environment where there was a high level of political awareness, and I think I found that here too.
Yeah.
For everything, I found that here too. So it wasn't. So no, it wasn't that hard, and but the jobs I've started to do since I was here, I've done loads of jobs, but the jobs I've started to do since I've here, I have been lucky enough to actually get paid for doing activism, which
brings me neatly to the point. How did you become involved with the Committee on the Administration of Justice? Was it a post advertised, or did you?
It was a post advertised. I'd done a number of other posts. I mean, one of the senses of injustice that when you live in other places you get is the treatment of migrants in other places. And I'd worked here for a few years on sort of migrant rights project, which again remains a key issue, even more so after Brexit, where there were essentially a populist right-wing uprising. And I started to work in migrant rights so at the beginning of this millennium, a bit further on, for a number of years. Then I worked in the Human Rights Commission, the official body as well, but wanted to move back into an independent organisation, and the CAJ stuff came in, and that's exactly what I wanted to do, and I've been there a decade now.
You mentioned migrant workers, and we had the luxury here a few weeks ago of interviewing a new citizen, a man originally from India, who came here and is a health worker during the battle with COVID. He took COVID. His wife, who's also from India and living and settled in West Belfast, is a nurse in the Royal. She took COVID. So here you had the situation where two people from the other side of the world are here defending this community against COVID, and still, albeit rarely, but still the subject of racism. It's kind of way depressing when you listen to someone talking about that. The migrant situation, and you mentioned Europe and all of that, is it as bad as, or has it got any better than what it was a few years back?
I think it probably has got more challenging for a lot of people, sort of populist anti-migrant racism, and you've seen the rise of the populist right across Europe as well. I mean, Brexit's very much a part of that tendency and mobilisation, but if you look at France, if you look at other places, if you even look at populist anti-migrant racism in countries where there isn't actually that much migration, you see Hungary and places like that have gone to the right. That's got to be the whole sort of model of fortress Europe, where yes, where you need to build that model. Human rights are called human rights for a reason. They're not called citizens' rights.
Yeah.
They're for everyone who is human. But you've got that basic erosion of civil rights where somehow particular rights are seen as not applying to sections of the community. If you think of something, here's something. If you think of something like internment, or to give it its official name, detention.
Yeah.
Detention without trial.
Yeah.
Essentially, now internment, or to give it its official name, detention without trial, is still alive and kicking here. Internment was performed in the 70s, not necessarily by regular cops, but by other units of the state, and that's still the case. You've got the British Home Office and Border Force still detaining people who have not been accused of anything that anyone would think is a criminal offence, putting them in old RUC barracks in Law, and often shipping people off to what's essentially a detention or internment camp in Scotland. You've got that, and if that was applied to the broader population, there would be a huge outcry. But just as it was wrong in the 70s for someone without trial, without charge, without all of the things you'd expect to kick someone's door and drag them away, it's equally wrong for that to be happening now to a particular section of the population. But it still goes too much below the radar than it should do.
In the north, I mean, just to put some kind of a focus on it, in the north, and I don't think numbers are necessarily the barometer. If it's happening to 2, it's too many. If it's happening to 20, how many people would be detained in these centres in the north? Have you any idea?
I don't have the figures, but you're probably talking about across the course of a year, hundreds, not, and sometimes it's quite difficult to get the figures. You're not talking about maybe 1 or 2. You're certainly talking about higher numbers. I want to check the numbers, but it's certainly, and it's the threat of that constantly, and living in the. But plus this, so this whole thing of the sort of the hostile environment, as it was caused, which in Britain brought that Windrush thing, but which was a huge scandal, but nothing's actually been done to dismantle the causes of that. Now we're seeing a bit of resistance from Scotland and recently from Communities Minister here, kicking back against some of the harsh elements of the hostile environment, using the sort of devolved power to push back against things like sort of trying to deport people for the crime of being poor, for finding themselves homeless and things like that. And I mean, the numbers, the migrant population here is very small.
Of course.
Yet still you've got this, and if the British Home Office managed the Windrush thing with just a couple of categories of entitlements, you can imagine what's going to happen now. Entitlements are shredded all over the place because of Brexit.
Can I ask you, and one of the things I think, first of all, you're absolutely right, and that issue is an issue, or should be an issue for us all. You know, it's not an issue for those who are on the receiving end of it. It's a violation of human rights should affect us all. We all should be concerned about it. A lot of this is driven by racism, of course. There is a perception that racism doesn't happen, or for some there's a perception that racism doesn't happen in nationalist areas or in the west of the city, the Falls Road area, just to put a name on it, or nationalist parts of the city. That's not true. Racism is what I can see, racism is nearly everywhere.
That's right. And I mean, all you have to do is ask the people who racism are targeted at, and they will give you that answer. There are differences though. I mean, I think in areas that are under the control of certain elements of loyalism, there is orchestrated racist campaigns of people being put out, and the number of times that happens, the number of sort of violent evictions from housing and things like that happen. There's also, I think, in different areas, different levels of community and political leadership against racism. I mean, certainly in this area, you've got a high level of community and political leadership against racism. Anti-racists in other areas have much more of a challenge, where they won't necessarily get where racist attacks, and there are a number of high-profile incidents of this may get up, but excused or explanations, any explanation other than racism is put out for them, and that means anti-racist work for the people on the ground doing it in those areas is a lot more difficult. So there is a different dynamic at play, and a vastly different dynamic, but that doesn't mean there's no racism.
Oh, absolutely.
And across the board, that's certainly people's lived experience.
And we're going to talk about the legacy issue, and you made the point before we began this conversation. Legacy is all our responsibility, and being anti-racist is, I mean, if the Irish can't be anti-racist, my God, there's something wrong. We all need to play our part in that. And you're right, some areas resisted better than others, but however. If I can fast forward you once again, which is very unfair, because once you get talking about one subject, I'm moving you up onto something else, but it's just a time factor. In terms of working on human rights, you're back in Belfast, you've done a number of jobs, you're now working for the committee. So has that experience changed, and has the issues changed from when you were a student here? Have they developed or got better or got worse or broadened or?
It's interesting. I mean, I think I said earlier on that some of the issues I was dealing with as a student in the student union and things like that were issues around the Irish language and around the LGBT rights and things like that. Now, that hasn't changed. They're still primarily the issues, but I suppose from a CAJ perspective, we always deal with the difficult issues, the issues that not every organisation, particularly with public funding, feels able to raise. We deal with the hard issues around housing and housing inequality would be one answer that other groups like PPR and others cover, but a lot of groups you're meant to, in these sort of forums that you attend, you're meant to politely raise the issue of how housing is segregated, but not mention what causes it. Not mention inequality.
Don't mention the war.
Don't mention inequality unless you're mentioning it in a very general way that doesn't actually point to statistics and facts. I mean, for a lot of years, even the Equality Commission, and its key inequalities document on housing, didn't mention housing inequalities faced by Catholics and nationalists, despite the evidence being very clear cut. There was very general stuff. Now they were cornered into a position where they do now do that. The statistics are there, but it was almost seen as that you couldn't raise that issue. It cut against it was divisive to raise an issue that cut against the sort of all-pervasive two tribes narrative rather than actually dealing with something. And then the causes of housing segregation, and it's not as if the individual people who need housing just don't want to live in a particular area or whatever else. It's fear of actual intimidation, and real intimidation that does happen. Yet it's a struggle to even get, despite the fact that the state intervenes to move hundreds of people a year because they make assessments of risk of death or serious injury. It's a struggle to even get statistics on that, and a struggle to get statistics on the source of threat, which largely come from within sections of loyalist paramilitarism. Quite often we're told those statistics don't exist, and then we stumble upon them somewhere else and see that they do exist. And until you identify those types of patterns, you cannot actually deal with stuff. But again, we turn up in these rooms and these forums and raise these issues, and people slink uncomfortably back in their seats.
I'm sure you're at the very top of their Christmas card list.
I would.
Can I ask you, in your own, and just as an individual, rather than from the CAJ perspective, but why don't we discuss the elephant in the room? Why don't we say that housing discrimination is historical, it's built into the structures of the state? Why don't we say those things when we all know? Is it because of bad manners, or because you don't need to, you don't want to see the obvious?
I think, and this goes back to the whole sort of angle around problems with the implementation of a lot of the right stuff within the peace settlement. There are things that were supposed to be done, but aren't being done because people are worried about doing things that make sections of political unionism angry. So there's almost this default position of, should I apply the law? Should I implement an agreement that we've actually signed off on? Or should I renege on that because it'll make unionism angry? Or sections of political unionism angry? And that still seems to massively drive huge aspects of policy here. Irish language, which is a touchstone issue, is a very obvious example. Good Friday Agreement committed to resolute action to protect the Irish language. It totally reset the relationship between the Irish-speaking community and the state. It was supposed to, anyway, move away from the sort of position that the old Stormont regime had and the sort of English-only policies and things like that,
Yeah.
and moved towards a different relationship. Yet that's been stymied at absolutely every, and obstructed at every path of the way. That's why it needs legislation. Yet again, the reluctance to move forward. I mean, two universities, seats of learning, meant to be the two progressive places, still essentially following the pre-Good Friday Agreement.
So this
English
is Queens,
only, Queens and the Ulster University,
yeah.
still essentially following the pre-Good Friday Agreement, if you look at signage and things like that, policy of English only monolingualism. And the issue being of, and when it's discussed, when you set out, but look, the UK government signed up to this, signed up to an international treaty where these things would be progressed, reset its relationship, committed that resolute action would be taken on specific duties by universities, and this isn't happening. And it's always the same sort of answer of, well, it's politically difficult, it's this and that. Almost the whole scheme of the agreements being turned on its head, where safeguards that were meant to protect rights have been flipped on the head to block rights. And that's, I think, the frustrating situation we all find ourselves in.
And it must be frustrating. And I mentioned earlier on that you or your office turn up at every human rights conference, at every, we're going to talk about legacy, but all these issues that affect people on a day-to-day basis, there is someone there. Those who thwart change, and I'm not talking about political unionism, I'm talking about the bureaucrats who say they don't want to upset anyone. They must also read the papers, hear the news, listen to the reports. I find it amazing that they still, in the universities, I suppose, are the worst example. The seats of learning prevent learning because they prevent the development of another language. Like, I mean, if it wasn't bizarre, you'd have to put a joke around it. How frustrating. You mentioned a small team. I think you said 7 in the
seven
office.
of us all together, yeah.
Are there occasions when you leave these engagements and you want to kick somebody's car? Is it just like over the same issue with the same people and listen to the same tripe?
It is incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating that there's also, at some of these things, there are so few of us raising these key issues, because there is still a climate of, I mean, there are obviously, I mean, back 20 or 30 years ago, it was far more dangerous to do the kind of work I do now. We are living in better times, but still there's a huge chill factor and huge amount of fear about raising particular issues, and it's hugely frustrating that things that get committed to just then don't happen. You've seen progress on some things, but on big picture, it's just block, 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 block.
I would imagine if it was me, I would be, well, I don't know how I would deal with them. So when you're not battling all these issues, and we mentioned some of them and there are many more we haven't covered, but when you're not battling them, how do you relax? How do you get that sense of that out of your head, that frustration out of your head?
I need to get better at relaxing.
So tell me what that means.
I like, yeah.
Do you walk, for instance?
I do walk quite a lot. I've become prisoner to the sort of step counter approach of, like, you have to do a certain amount of steps a day to try and, but I end up filling my head with all of this and other stuff when I do walk, and I try and we get up the coast a lot as well, family, with lots of.
And I know you're an adapted North Belfast person, so
yeah.
So you're in the shadow of the Cave Hill.
Oh yeah. So that, I mean, it's incredibly lucky to be in the shadow of all that sort of green space and things like that. Have a mountain. There are lots of cities with a mountain overlooking them, but this is one with a whole mountain range, and it's a great place to. And you've the rest of Antrim as well.
Yeah.
As well in that coastline, it's spent a lot of time there with my wife Mairead and the kids, and I'm
told you're a prolific reader. Is that true, or is that? I don't mean reader of reports. I mean reader as in general.
I don't read that much. I'd like to read a bit more. I'm actually working very slowly. I suppose it's just time with the sort of with kids, with the both of us having full-time jobs, things like that. Yeah, it's difficult to take out time for it, but I do enjoy reading stuff. I do enjoy reading papers, and I do get through some heavy books as well. I'm halfway through Robbie McVeigh and Bill Ralston's
Oh yeah, it's
latest
an
book, which is an absolutely
an excellent
fascinating read. But he, as one of
Absolutely.
your previous guests, as he himself said, it's heavy. It's heavy reading, but it's not in the same sense. You need that level of detail in that subject, and there's nothing they appear to have missed out. About halfway through it, it's fantastic.
I read it,
Yeah.
and I think increasingly, and just something that I wanted to pick up on that you said earlier on, sometimes it's not enough to say this exists without saying why it exists. And that book traces the foundation of the state, and it traces a lot of the inbuilt inherent discrimination and inequality, and it puts it into the context of a defence mechanism for the perpetuality of the state. So I think it's I would commend it to anyone that read it. Music, do you like music?
Yeah, I do like music. I kind of the sort of digital age has made me fragment and lose touch with it a wee bit. It was easier when you just had a pile of records, and now you have to. Well, you don't have to. I suppose if you're better organised, you wouldn't be downloading songs and things like that. But yeah,
They were the days. That's one of the signs of an ill-spent youth, that you're able to trace music through CDs, and prior to that,
vinyl, even.
and vinyl.
Yeah.
We have a battle looming, and you talked about that, or we both talked about that elephant in the room. So for human rights groups, for campaigning groups, for concern groups, we have a battle underway, the battle of legacy.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind, just take us through the proposed changes and the ideology behind the changes, and then we'll talk a wee bit about what can be done. So we have the legacy reforms or the legacy changes by the British government.
Well, if you start with a human rights perspective, what this is about is three things, and it's always the three strands. One is truth, getting to the truth, important for families but important for everyone. One is justice, for some families very important as well. The other, which is often missed out, is non-recurrence, that it doesn't happen again, that things were done, that patterns of human rights violations that fueled conflict don't reoccur. So this is the case globally. Where we're at, as there's been a number of attempts to come up with a legacy package that will work. The Stormont House Agreement was reached in 2014. That should have been, ironically, had it been legislated for straight away when it was supposed to, and legislated for properly in a human rights compliant manner, a lot of its work would now be completing, and a lot of families would have had access to truth and the other path to justice, non-recurrence, all of that sort of stuff. It was obstructed and delayed by the British government, who have the only ones who can really legislate to bring this in. And now they've, despite in the New Decade, New Approach Agreement, committing to legislating finally for the Stormont House Agreement within 100 days, they've completely torpedoed it. And they put out a sense of, I know government in England at the moment is a very Donald Trump type government, and when you read the command paper, its grand title, the new legacy proposals they put forward, it reads very much like that. There's a lot of stuff in it that is an entirely false narrative, and it's sort of pinned on the idea that the British government, unlike all the rest of us thickos who couldn't possibly have thought of this, has all of a suddenly realised that it'd be much better just having a truth recovery process rather than what everyone else is doing, which is hopelessly pursuing prosecutions which aren't going to happen. That's the narrative. Now that narrative is a complete lie. If you look at the Stormont House Agreement, it itself and a lot of other models, and including some of the existing mechanisms like inquests, are all based on truth recovery. So even you had a mechanism within the Stormont House Agreement where there would be proper police type investigations of unresolved conflict related deaths, but that the main product from them would be a report for each family, but it would be truth recovery with teeth. You'd have the powers to actually get to the bottom of stuff. And there was another mechanism which was an international sort of body where people, whether in their capacity as ex-combatants, as witnesses, as victims, could go, and anything that said would be protected, wouldn't lead it. So all of that infrastructure was there. It's been ditched for this new proposed information recovery body, IRB. Obviously no one in and I thought that acronym might have been used sometime before, where you have a body with virtually no powers whatsoever to do desktop reviews, which hardly anyone will actually cooperate with. So you've got the type of body dressed up as truth recovery, but that's in fact least likely to reach the truth for any family, accompanied by an amnesty that we've worked out is worse than General Pinochet's amnesty.
And
that's the one that's always put forward as the worst example of a self-amnesty. And we know what this is all about.
Tell me what it's about.
It's about cover-up. It's very clear what it's all about. Yes, there is a political problem that the Conservative Party has, which is an organised lobby of military veterans who does not want to see prosecutions of soldiers. But if that was the only issue the British government have, there are other ways they could deal with that. If they couldn't contemplate a soldier doing a single day in jail, a soldier convicted of murder through these processes, doing a single day in jail, there's already a 2-year scheme under the Good Friday Agreement that they could have reduced that further. The Secretary of State has the power to do that. They've not gone for that option. So there's more to this, and we know what the more to this is.
Please tell us.
Well,
don't assume that we know.
Well, we know the more to this is what we've witnessed over the last 20 years, which is efforts to obstruct practically every legacy mechanism that's been set up, and you get this very slow drip of truth. You occasionally get inquests or ombudsman's reports that reveal a bit more.
So that's the delay part that you're referring to.
It's the delay, but it's also about concealing patterns of human rights violations that took place and elements of security policy that were outside the law. To pick two examples that we'll know, that informant-based collusion as one. That there, even with the Stormont House Agreement, the first reason why it was derailed, you may remember this, was over what was loosely termed the national security veto. That wasn't anywhere to be read in the Stormont House Agreement, but was built in by the British government. And when you looked at the law, the draft law that they put forward to implement that, what did it say? It basically allowed ministers, British ministers, a veto over the contents of the reports going to families, so they could remove national security information. How did they define that? Well, they did a bit of a Humpty Dumpty thing by saying it was anything that's in the national security interests of the UK, which practically means whatever they want it to mean.
Anything?
Yeah, although I think they were worried about that because they thought they would take whatever interpretation, but a judge might not and might narrow it down. But it also said that sensitive information was any information that was provided by security and so special branch through MI5. It was basically trying to put all of that stuff out of bounds of the truth recovery mechanism. And that example of sort of trying to get to the bottom of informant-based collusion, but also in terms of issues like torture, goes to that third limb I mentioned earlier on. Yes, it's important to families, of course, but it's also really important in terms of non-recurrence, and not necessarily non-recurrence here. We know that the torture techniques that were used here in the 1970s, they what were called the 5 techniques at the time, but we now know there were more. Things like, and although the word was never used, waterboarding. The word wasn't really used till the Iraq War, but it's the same thing. We also now know from a Truth Commission report that those types of techniques were taught, and Goodwood Barracks was involved and named, and but taught to the Brazilian military during their dictatorship. And we know that through a Truth Commission report. Obviously not our Truth Commission report, because we don't have one, but the Brazilian one sets out some of that sort of stuff. But we also know that because there wasn't proper accountability, it wasn't hammered at the time, and there hasn't been accountability now for the use of torture, that it's happened again. That it's happened again in Iraq and Afghanistan. The same type of things have turned up, the same type of things have fueled conflict. I suspect, I don't know this, because I don't know much about what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it wouldn't surprise me if the same models of gangs and counter-gangs and that type of thing has also recurred in other places. So we really need we really need accountability for these things for a much broader reason, which is that reason of non-recurrence, trying to make these things untenable so they don't happen again.
And I'm going to ask you just to conclude by telling us what we can do, but there are, just to harden the point you're making, there are very practical examples where the preservation or the prevention, sorry, not preservation, prevention of these things is important and could stop others. For instance, the Ballymurphy massacre led directly to the Bloody Sunday massacre.
Yeah.
Had there been accountability, had there been a spotlight, had there been all of that, perhaps, and who knows, but perhaps it could have stopped. It could have stopped or prevented the Bloody Sunday massacre. Where do we go? And tell me what, because you make the point, the legacy issue is not only for the families, it's for us all. It's for us, our future, our children's, and in my case, grandchildren's future. So what should we be doing around legacy? How do we prevent this crime being recommitted?
Well, I suppose there's elements of it. I mean, the reform process, policing reform and things like that for the current contemporary situation here is very important. It's important there's no backsliding on that. We've gone from a situation where torture and ill treatment in custody were fairly widespread to one where it's pretty much been stamped out, and it's important there's never any backsliding on that. I think around the whole covert policing stuff there's still work to do, but that's the present. In terms of legacy, I mean, you are dealing with, and I said before, a Trump-like administration over the water, so it's very, very difficult to predict what it will do next, and it's very difficult with that type of administration to bombard them with facts and evidence, because it doesn't seem to make any difference.
Yeah.
They just don't seem to care. I think we just need to keep up what we are doing, which is shouting from the rooftops of any platform we have about what's going on. It's very well known here, but beyond this jurisdiction, even in terms of discourse, media discourse in the South and things like that, and in Britain as well, there needs to, and internationally, there needs to be a lot more shouting about what's going on here, because there's a real false narrative being pushed by the Northern Ireland Office, which is somehow this narrative that they're really about truth recovery and that everyone else is pushing prosecutions, which was never the case. Everyone knew, for all the evidential reasons, whatever legacy process there is, that prosecutions would be full and far between. But this sort of false narrative of that, when we're hit with questions of, well, you're not being unrealistic, should you not be looking at these truth recovery models? You go, whoa, hang on, we were always looking. Everyone else was always looking at models that would effectively recover truth. I think we need to nail a lie at the moment. That's the false narrative that the state is trying to build around these sort of proposals. I think that really is the first task, that this isn't about them wanting an information recovery. This is about designing a mechanism which is really about information concealment and preventing facts and evidence from emerging, and that should alarm us deeply.
And it's not all doom and gloom, because in this last few days we have had the American Congress make an issue and pointing out to the British that they had to do, I suppose, for the use of a better legal term, the decent thing, the right thing, and help legacy recovery rather than delay it. And we've also had the UN intervention.
We've had some very strong words from the UN experts who deal with these particular issues, who've basically said the UK will be in flagrant breach of its international human rights obligations if it proceeds down the way. It will block access to truth, etc. And they've briefed the Human Rights Council, the sort of primary intergovernmental body, on this. So yes, there's international, there's the beginnings of an international voice on this, and you have to remember, this is bad for us, but and whilst Britain's role in the world is much diminished to what it maybe thinks it is, it's still a permanent member of the Security Council. It's still a relatively powerful state, and it's still a state that regimes around the world may well use to say, well, they've done it, why can't we adopt this type of model to deal with sort of legacy issues in our own jurisdiction? That's the international impact this kind of thing could have if it goes ahead.
We've came to the end of this interview. You'll probably be glad to hear, because I've put you through it, as the expression goes. We have a lot of work to do. No one group can do it on their own, so it's a collective effort, and I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing. And from a personal point of view, my son was defended by the Committee for the Administration of Justice some years ago, and very much to their credit. I want to thank you for the work that you're currently involved in, and for being my guest this evening on Scéalta. Thank you.
Culture.